Introduction, and thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this very interesting panel. I'm going to leave this conflict of interest slide up because I'm really conflicted about this topic. I am really a believer in JBJS and have participated on the editorial board since 1992 when I was the deputy editor for trauma and outcomes research. And for nearly 5 years, I've been the editor-in-chief. I like to say I run the complaint department at the journal. When you have an 18% acceptance rate and 82% rejection rate, you have a lot of unhappy people. And I realize that without authors sending us their very best work, you need to communicate with them and make sure that they feel like they got a fair hearing and that they don't leave mad and that they'll come back with their best stuff. So we are an old journal, nearly 130 years, and we were founded by the American Orthopedic Association, which was the first orthopedic association in the world, and have been around for a long time. I have an image there of our new website, which we released, we call it the Hub, about a year ago, and I would invite you to use it. We have invested a lot in a search engine, so you can search all of our 6 journals as well as the entire orthopedic literature in a very refined search engine. I want to point out that we just recently signed an agreement with OrthoEvidence, with Dr. Bandari's love of his life, and we hope to be working together on strategic initiatives that's going to provide the world of orthopedics with even more robust information sources. So what's the impact factor? It is traditionally the 2-year impact factor, and it's the number of manuscripts you publish divided by the number of times those manuscripts are cited. And here you can see our history. I think in the surgical specialties, the 5-year impact factor is more important than the 2-year impact factor, and you can see that we went down by a few percentage points in 2017, but our 5-year impact factor went up by about 5%. So that's something that's very encouraging to me as the editor-in-chief. Here are the relevant orthopedic journals in the top echelon. The sports journal is at the top. I will point out that if you present at their meeting, you're required to publish in their journal, so it's a bit of a fudge factor there. I will also point out that we at JBJS do not do any funny business with fooling around with the impact factor. There are ways that editors can game the scheme, and we don't do that. Here we see the other general orthopedic competitors, if you will. So the field of orthopedic scientific publication is growing. You can see here some recent data in the trend. Open access as a phenomenon is relatively stable at about 12% of publications in our field. We can talk about open access if you wish. It's a worldwide phenomenon, mostly based out of national funding agencies which want the information they fund to be available to everybody and not behind a paywall. So this slide will interact with the prior speaker. What should you do research on? I think it really is something you have to be naturally curious about. And we ask in our submission on the very front page, how is your research going to change clinical practice? And if you don't have a good answer to that, we're probably not interested in further considering. But the ways to get interesting issues to study are conference discussions, treatment about individual patients, critical reading of journal articles, or serving as a reviewer. And then skepticism. I noticed there's a healthy bit of skepticism at this meeting for a presentation that have been discussed robustly. And I think that's a way to really develop a research question. And then once you've done that, you should consider where your target journal should be. We're a general orthopedic journal. We generally publish subspecialty articles of broad interest to a wider orthopedic community, and we do publish about 10% basic science articles that have important clinical relevance. If you're research is a little more narrowly focused, you would strongly consider a subspecialty journal. And oftentimes, manuscripts that we reject, the main reason for rejecting it is that it is more appropriate for a subspecialty journal. And then I mentioned Basic Science Journal. We don't publish in vitro work in general, and if your in vivo and your biomechanics work has high clinical relevance, we're very interested in that. So we're primarily a clinical research journal, and the types of studies we publish: case control, cross-sectional studies, cohort studies. They're the most common type of manuscript submitted. And we range from randomized trials to case series. We publish about 12% of our material as level 1 evidence now. I would say to you that the most important thing that I'll say today is that you should follow the strobe guidelines for cohort studies and the consort guidelines for randomized trials. I'll have a few slides here in a minute. We generally would like to see more than 2 years of follow-up for reconstructive procedures, and the level of evidence is very important in terms of your chances of getting published. Here's the level of evidence pyramid, which you're all familiar with. This we announced in 2004, an editorial by Jim Wright and myself, and really changed the whole face of the way our research is published across the orthopedic world, as well as presented at scientific meetings. Case series is a level 4 evidence, and people say that we shouldn't publish level 4 evidence, but that's never going to be true in orthopedics. We have many, many conditions that we treat that simply are not common enough where they would be appropriate for a randomized trial. So we will always be publishing well-done cohort studies. I often point out for people interested in this question that we're 3% of the doctors in the United States, and our CPT codes is how we bill for our services, and we're 3% of the doctors with 40% of the CPT codes. So that's how broad our field is, and there will always be a need for level 4 evidence. We have seen a decrease in these submissions lately and an increase in levels 1, 2, and 3. And in general, the higher the level of evidence, the higher your citation. So let's dig in a little bit more on these checklists. The consort checklist is important for randomized trials. There is the website. But one that's lesser known is the strobe guidelines, which is a 22-item checklist that's very useful for case control cohorts and cross-sectional studies. Here is a portion of the consort list, which just shows the various aspects that you should cover in your manuscript. And of course, the consort diagram is mandatory for all controlled trials. You can see in this example the number of subjects that were screened, the number that were rejected or not included, and the reasons why, and then those that were randomized with the division tree all the way down to the number that were followed and the number that were lost to follow-up. This is required for all level 1 studies. Here is a portion of the strobe statement, which is 6 of the 22 items, and what this does is it will basically force you to provide all of the information that reviewers are going to want to see for your research. We have a publication in the journal in 2015 that provides orthopedic examples for all 22 items on the strobe checklist, and I encourage you to follow this for your cohort studies. So as I mentioned, we do publish biomechanics and in vivo studies. We have published some meta-analyses and systematic reviews. We have policies surrounding these, which we did in an editorial recently. Basically, you need to have at least 2 randomized trials to be considered for a meta-analysis approach. We also have a rule that a similar meta-analysis has not been published in the last 5 years. These are resource intense, and in general we are discouraging this type of submission because we do see a lot of these. Basically, you can do research from the comfort of your couch, and it's all too easy to do these types of studies. A systematic review is where you're doing an organized review of the literature where there's inadequate level 1 and level 2 studies. So before you start your research, and this Dr. Vaccaro already outlined this, you need to have a involvement of a statistician. This will keep you from going off in a trajectory that's going to produce a lot of work with a no appropriate result. It should be an appropriate research topic that you're naturally curious about and interested in, and you should be able to state a hypothesis. And it's ideal if you have one major hypothesis and not multiple hypotheses. And again, a statistician to do a power calculation is extremely important. You need to obtain IRB approval. This has been covered, and you need to register the trial. We now have a policy which has been signed on by the BJJ as well as clinical orthopedics. If you have a clinical trial where a patient has been recruited before the trial has been registered, and we will check on that, we will not accept your study. So what we're trying to do here is to enforce appropriate human subjects research when clinical trials are involved. You must register the trial. I'm not sure, actually, if there is a separate clinical trials registration organization in India, but clinicaltrials.org is the most widely used internationally. UK has their own, other countries have their own. So I would encourage you, as you're beginning to prepare your manuscript, to carefully read the instructions for authors. They're different from each journal. I would start with an outline, and then as you begin writing, use a single paragraph for a single subject. Use simple and concise language. We have a word limit of 3,000. And read and cite primary sources. Don't rely on prior publications. There is a study which we published which 28% of citations are inaccurate. So obtain the primary source references, read them yourself, and make sure that you are quoting them accurately. The abstract is the most important thing. This is where I spend the majority of my time editing, because often we busy surgeons, it's the only thing we read. So they need to be short, pithy sentences. They need to have a results section and conclude with a brief sentence on the major findings and how this is going to change practice. Here's an example of an outstanding abstract. There's basically 2 sentences in each section, and it's easy to skim and easy to read, and this is what we like to see. So to publish in high-impact journals, you need to carefully prepare the manuscript. The introduction is often written as too long. Keep it short and end with a hypothesis that you're testing. The methods should be where the majority of the word count should be, exactly what you did and how you did it, and what statistical methods were used. And as I've already emphasized, use the Consort, Strobe, or PRISMA guidelines. PRISMA is for meta-analyses. And if you use those, I've already mentioned, your chances of getting accepted are much higher. The results section need to address the hypotheses, and this is where the implications on clinical findings need to be listed. The statistical analysis needs to be reported clearly. I will point out we have 4 deputy editors for statistics and methodology, so any manuscript that has any complex statistics are reviewed for accuracy before we proceed to publication. And then the discussion is an area where you compare your results with other studies, and you need to state what's important and new in your findings, how it's going to change clinical practice, and it will help others who are going to do research in this area going forward. This is also an important thing for you to understand. The text is the story. The tables are the data, and the figures are to illustrate the data. And they should be clear, and we usually limit to 6 to 8, so we don't detract from readers' attention. Now a little bit about our submission history. You can see in the 6th column down, India, 9 submissions in 15 and 16. It's gone up to 12, and already this year 15, so we've had an increase in submissions from India. Here is the history of submissions. You can see in 2013 with the asterisk there, that's when we instituted a submission fee. I could discuss that as to why we did that, but we don't have a submission fee for India. We reserved the submission fee for countries where research is supported financially by federal governments in large measure, and that's not yet the case in India. Here are our 6 journals and the numbers of submissions. I would like to point out for the junior researchers in the audience, JBJS Case Connector. This is a compilation of now about 5,000 cases. Previously, a case report was one which had never before been published. What we're trying to do here is to have a compilation of cases that you might see once or twice in your 30 to 40-year career. It has about a 50% acceptance rate. What we're trying to build is a clinically useful research database where you can search for the patient with a Klippel file who has an ACL injury and what was done and what the outcomes were. So you junior researchers who are just getting started, a case report is a very good way to get started. We have a review journal, as you can see, which has gained increasing acceptance. All of our journals are now cited in Index Medicus, and our open access journal has got a 2-year history now. We're trying to be very, very careful with what we publish in the open access journal. So the review process, there are biases with reviewers. We practice double-blind review. We have staff that eliminate any areas of your manuscript that would identify where the research comes from. It is true, however, that non-primary English speakers whose writing is not so perfect, this is detectable, and there is a bias against this. What we tell reviewers is it's not your job to correct the English. We have copy editors that will correct that. We want you to comment on the quality of the research. And any reviewers that we have that are biased against that problem, we correct them or we fire them, basically. And it is helpful to have somebody who's proficient in English to read your manuscript before you submit it. What we ask the reviewers to do is to comment on the validity of the study design, the strengths and weaknesses, are the conclusions supported by the data. Our copy editors check the tables and numbers for correctness, and we ask the reviewers to comment on the data collection and methods. It is very common to have underpowered studies in orthopedics, although that problem is improving as time goes on. We look for a balance and presentation of text, tables, and figures, and we ask the reviewers to comment on any ethical issues they might identify. Oftentimes, you're asked to resubmit, so it's a C+ decision or a B decision. And what we would like you to understand is we don't want you to get into an argument with reviewers and tell them they don't know what they're talking about. That's generally unsuccessful in getting your manuscript published. What is important is to have a brief cover letter. I'll show you an example, and then keep the revisions very succinct. So this is an ideal cover letter. This is going to make us happy. It's basically one paragraph and says that we've commented on each and every reviewer's comment. And this is tabular form, the way to do it, to have the reviewer's comment on the left and your response on the right. Keep it very brief, and again, don't get into arguments in this. Just a few slides at the end on biomedical research expenditures by country. I thought you'd be interested in this. This is via 2012. At that time, India was increasing biomedical research, and our country was not. And here is a slide that documents the orthopedic publication practices across the Asia Pacific, and you can see China going up at a very rapid rate. At this time, China is now assigning 4% of their gross domestic product into biomedical research. So they are very much pouring resources into scientific publication. So for my Indian colleagues here in the room, I would recommend for cohort studies, prospective data collection with a hypothesis. Retrospective studies are less likely to get published in high-impact journals. Choose a condition that is common enough that you and your colleagues will remember that you're actually enrolling patients in a study. Choose achievable outcomes and time points, and whenever possible to have individuals that are blinded to the treatment assess the results, such as physical therapists who aren't involved in the surgical application of the patient, etc. You can use multi-center formats if you have close collaboration with your colleagues. And then for those who are interested in trying to do control trials, please have the mechanism to follow the patients in place. That's a real problem. Have very straightforward outcomes measures. Use blinded assessment where possible. And in general, when you're first starting out with control trials, your first effort should be at a single center. So I thank you for your attention. I know you in India have interesting research, and I hope that you will send your very best research to JBJS. Thank you very much.
Thank you.